The signatories include indigenous peoples and farmers' movements, climate justice and environmental networks, among others. Some of the demands of the manifesto include a ban on all geoengineering field experiments and deployment, a stop to all open-air experiments, a stop to all large-scale carbon capture and storage and direct air capture projects because they perpetuate fossil fuel extraction and combustion, and a stop to all bioenergy with carbon capture and storage projects. And the support for the diversity of alternatives to confront climate change that are already proven and less risky, but are sidelined in climate change deliberations. To date, over 2 organizations have signed the manifesto. If your organization would like to sign on to the manifesto, please email us. We'll provide the email address in the chat box. The details will be posted in the chat box, as well as links to our website and social media accounts. So to fully begin, geoengineering, the intentional large-scale intervention in the Earth's soils, oceans, and atmosphere for the purposes of combating climate change, is perhaps one of the most controversial and highly charged discussions for both opponents and proponents of the techniques and technologies proposed. We are at a climate tipping point. The impacts of the climate crisis are disproportionately felt in the global South by First Nations and Indigenous communities, by Black and Brown people, by women, by children, smallholder and peasant farmers, nomads, pastoralists, basically the most marginalized across the world, are bearing the biggest brand of a crisis they didn't create, which further exacerbates already existing multiple and intersecting inequalities. We know what's at stake. Yet, for the last few decades, increasingly, the solutions being proposed by global elites in the tech financial sector, northern governments, and even within multilateral spaces such as the UN, continue to commodify nature and are responsible for human rights violations and further destruction of ecosystems in the same communities experiencing the worst impacts of the climate crisis. The Home campaign maintains that geoengineering is one of such proposals, and it further incentivizes particular corporate elites, including those in the fossil fuel sector. And importantly, it distracts us from addressing the root causes of the climate crisis. This webinar is designed to address 3 fundamental intersections of geoengineering: the governance questions, the techno-deterministic roots and ideas of these technologies, finally, human rights issues, indigenous sovereignty, and responses from climate justice movements worldwide. We will also engage with the alternatives that grassroots movements and communities worldwide have been championing. Our 3 panelists today are Silvia Ribeiro, the Latin American director for the ETC Group. She's a longtime climate justice activist and journalist. For those of you who have been within the UN multilateral spaces, I'm sure you know Silvia very, very well. The second panelist is Dr. Max Agil. Max is a researcher in rural sociology, anti-war and environmental activist. He is an associate researcher at the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty. Our final panelist today is Tom Goldtooth, someone who I'm sure many of you know. Tom is a Native American environmental, climate, and economic justice activist. He's a speaker, film producer, an indigenous rights leader within the climate and environmental justice and indigenous movement, and I will add globally, because Tom has often lent his support to movements even in Africa. He's the executive director of the Indigenous Environmental Network. And without much ado, I will hand over to our very first panelist. Just keep in mind that we'll be posting links on the chat box. Please free to ask questions in the chat box or comments, but also we have a Q&A. So you can also paste, you can also put your questions within the Q&A, and you can paste comments in the chat box. And so I will ask Silvia to begin the conversation, the teaching, the webinar today.
Hello, is it okay? You can hear me? Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be with all of you today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. As Ruth said, I have been following the issue of geoengineering for quite some time, over 13 years now. And I would like to give you, I will take a few slides, if please you can let me share the screen. But I won't use many because I have been asked to be more interactive, to speak more with you than just showing slides. But if you give me the possibility to share, I don't have it. Nikki, if you could give me the possibility to share the screen.
Could you try now, Silvia?
No, it doesn't appear there.
Okay,
now.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hello, can you see the slide now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's great. Okay, well, I call this short talk like a smoke and mirrors amidst climate chaos, because I think that geoengineering is a lot about that. And you won't get in this session a description of all the techniques on geoengineering, but just the general of it. And geoengineering, what we call geoengineering, what is called geoengineering in, for instance, United Nations, is comprises a set of techniques to intentionally intervene in and alter the ecosystems of the Earth on a mega scale, on land, on air, on seas. It is to try to manipulate the climate system as a whole in an attempt to counteract some of the effects of climate change. It is, in simple words, a so-called techno-fix for climate change. And those who propose geoengineering usually use different categories, like one which is called CDR, which is carbon dioxide removal or greenhouse gas removal, which is to remove gases from the atmosphere after they have been emitted and bury them bury them in some place. So the other one is solar radiation management, which is to reflect sunlight or part of the sunlight back into the space to reduce the warming effect. And the third one is weather modification, which is to modify the weather more at a local level, at regional level, like, for instance, cloud seeding and changing rain patterns and these kind of things. Just to give you a general picture of there are maybe like 20 or 30, 25, 30 different technologies proposed. They are new, more all the time. But these ones that I'm showing here is just, this is not our picture. I'm sorry, I forgot to put the credit there. But it's basically so you can see that it's about intervening in all ecosystems. Like, for instance, in the case of sunlight, maybe create some kind of artificial clouds that will reflect back the sunlight, imitating what the effects of a volcano eruption. But also in the seas is about changing the chemistry of the seas by making it more alkaline or by fertilizing it with iron, or brightening the clouds, for instance, with non-tripulated vessels, and so that will also theoretically have a reflecting effect. There is also a lot of proposals on land, and those on land are the most advanced. For instance, what is called carbon capture and storage, that I will refer a little more on, which is about like capturing already emitted gases and try to bury them underground on sea or land. So what I want to, you will have a lot of documents to look at the different technologies. So what I want to stress now is that the majority of the proposals are not in place. They are not even, you know, a physical concept of it. But the few ones, there are a very few ones that you can see models of, or something that has been functioning. but most are non-proven proposals. And none of the proposed geoengineering technique have really proven to be viable from the economically, technically, ecologically point of view, but much less to be really a tool for climate change that will function and that will not have a lot of side effects that will make things worse. So among these theoretical proposals, there is one that has been around for decades, which is carbon capture and storage. This was before called enhanced oil recovery, because it was about that. It was about accessing oil that was in very deep reserves. So they could be used to produce, well, they could be used to produce more oil, to extract more oil. And even today, there are only like 20 or a little bit more than 20 CCS facilities. And of all these CCS facilities, the majority is to extract more oil, to access deep reserves. So none of the proposals that we have today on geoengineering are aimed to address the structural causes of climate change. So climate change basically will continue to be produced. It's just that this is about managing some of the symptoms, which in reality creates a captive market. So you don't change the causes, you just change what you can do with some of the symptoms. And if it could function, the theory would be that then what you have created is a new market, not a solution for climate change. So I will speak more than explain by slides now. So this is the last one that I wanted to put here, just for you to say that this is a book that we did with the Heinrich Böll Foundation on Biofuel Watch. And there are a description here of the different technologies, the impacts that we see on the technologies, the actors. So I recommend that you pick the one that you need in your language and can continue to see the specifics of the technologies here. So I will go back, we'll take out. Okay, so I hope that you can see me now. Is it okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so so I want to make a few points now, so you can have some ideas that we can debate. This is just the first one of a series of webinars that we will have together with the home campaign. So any doubts, issues that you think should be explained better, we can go back to them. What I want to say now is that of this set of proposed technologies, the first thing, there are many problems with that. There are environmental problems, there are political problems, there are geopolitical problems, there are also problems on the economies. But one of the main problems is that for geoengineering to really work, as it says it will work, which is about modifying the climate, kind of, addressing climate change in some ways, it has to be deployed at mega scale. It has really to be deployed by manipulating Earth systems. And that means that the risks and the problems with that will also be very, very large. So one common mistake that people do is to think about the technology separated from the scale, and this is not possible to do. Because if you only do a small scale anything, it's not geoengineering by definition, and it's not going to influence the climate. It will have local impacts, other impacts, but it's not about climate. It's about a particular technology. And so what we have today in reality is that geoengineering is mostly functioning as a giant excuse, not so much as a concrete proposal for climate change. Because what geoengineering, by not touching the root causes, is doing is to ignore the climate injustice where the climate change has come about. I'm sure that most of you have seen this recent Oxfam report where they say how much the different parts of the populations have produced, and half of the populations over 3,500 million people, half of the people in the world, the poorest people, have only estimated produce 7% of all greenhouse gases ever emitted. That leaves the other half with 93%. But of the other half, only 10% of the people, the richest population in the world, has produced 53% of all the emissions. And when you don't touch this kind of injustice that are in the ground, then you need a techno-fix. You say, okay, we are not going to touch what really is causing climate change, which is the exploitation of fossil fuels and its application to industry and the industrial model of consumption and production. And if we don't touch that, because that is what in reality is what the geoengineering imply, is if you don't touch that, then you need a techno-fix. And it has to be a giant techno-fix to really take care of this, giant problem. So if we go back and see, well, but some people says, well, but maybe these technologies, maybe they will function. So maybe why don't we try them? Well, let's look at the technologies that are more or less in place. One of them is direct air capture, which is about taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, put it a lot of chemicals that I don't know where they will go after used, and nobody else, and then bury them non-stance or reuse them. If you reuse them, which is called carbon capture, use and storage, then they will go out again later at some point. So it's just like, postponing a little bit, but it's not about really storing or capturing. So the same happens with this, with all the proposals, for instance, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, in which our friends from Biofuel Watch have done very good analysis and evaluations. And there is no functioning installation of BECCS, although BECCS is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But all of them, both DAC and bioenergy with CCS, they rely on CCS. And for that, we will need like in the order of thousands or tens of thousands of CCS installations. And we today have 20, and of them, only 10% is not devoted to extract more oil. This is a very key point in the case, for instance, of carbon capture and storage, because if it needs more energy that it can store in gases, then it is producing new gases all the time. And this is a lot of what is happening with this first part of carbon dioxide removal. Then they also tell us that we will still need techniques, because these techniques are needed because climate change is going on and we need to do something, because it will go on even if we stop, if we reduce the emissions, and it will continue. Yeah, the problem is that none of these technologies are proven to function, and they will have a lot of other impacts. For instance, which I just said on carbon capture and storage, will have local impacts on communities, on contamination, on the invasion of territories that we will hear later, for instance, from Tom and others. So what they are telling us is that the future is serious and is uncertain, and because of that, we need to use uncertain technologies that will have a lot of uncertain risks. And that is one of the things that I think we cannot accept. So another thing that is happening with this is that there is really a will from those that propose geoengineering to try to delink themselves from geoengineering. So they want to call it carbon removal or carbon dioxide removal or solar radiation management, or separate it, or call it something together different, which is climate altering technologies, or climate restoration is the latest spin from geoengineering forces, which is to try to get all of us in the world to not understand that this is a set of technologies that really doesn't have a solid ground, that are mostly speculative and that are not proven, but that they want governments, companies, and many others to invest million, billion, trillions of dollars instead of real solutions to climate change. So one, geoengineering is somewhere in between a really dangerous illusion and a very, very dangerous distraction from what we really need to do. I want to make a last point, which is that many of those who propose geoengineering and many others are saying, well, you know, we will have geoengineering, whatever you do. There is nothing to do because we need it and we have to invest on this. And because of this, we need governance. But there is already governance in United Nations. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity and the London Convention, which is the convention that regulates dumping on the seas, that says that, no, we should have a precautionary approach on this because this has so many risks that it will be worse. It will be more imbalance in the climate. It will bring more problems than we already have. And because of that, they have called for a moratorium on all geoengineering techniques and also on particularly on ocean fertilization in the London Convention. To this, they also say, well, they allow this moratoria in United Nations for a small-scale experiment. But the small-scale experiments that are proposed to be done, like for instance, SCOPEX through the Harvard University, or marine cloud browsing in Australia, or Oceaneos on ocean fertilization in Chile and Peru, or ICE 911, that now is called something else in the Arctic. And all of these are, again, small experiments that won't tell anything about if these technologies will be useful for climate change. They will only provide tools for those that want to advance geoengineering, but won't tell us anything about it. And they are not even respecting the conditions that the Convention on Biological Diversity has put even for small-scale experiments. So because of that, they are in violation of this decision of this moratorium from CBD and the London Convention. So the last that I want to say is that we are in such a serious situation on climate change that we don't have time to continue losing the time we have and the resources we have in false solutions. In 1990, you know, it was the date that was taken by the Kyoto Protocol to say we need to reduce the emission 5% under the level of 1990. 2015, according to this new report from Oxfam, 60% more emissions has been emitted from 90 to 2015. This is because the Kyoto Protocol and the negotiation hasn't been about real solutions, real reductions at source, at consumption. They have been about carbon markets and false solutions. And now we have this new concept, which is the net zero. We are not going to reduce, we are going to do an exercise of accounting. We are going to do math instead of real solutions, which is, we can continue emitting, but we are going to remove it here and there. We sold these technologies that are not even in place, that are not even proven. So they are saying, oh, they are not even proven, but if you give us a lot of money, we will do it. This is what companies has been saying last week in the climate summit, in the climate week that they have in New York, where lots of transnational companies are really eager to say, oh, we will get to net zero because we will invest in either the technologies on very, very large plantations that will devastate indigenous and peasant territories and compete with food security. So of course, for companies and the very small percent of the population that has caused climate change, it's all about new business and new technologies. And this is the core of what is behind geoengineering. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Silvia. Thank you for that. We'll return to your presentation after we finished everyone's presentation. And so now I pass it on to Max or Jill. If you've just arrived, the bios are in the chat box. I'll not repeat the introduction. Max?
Thank you so much, and thank you, Silvia, for that excellent presentation, and the rest of you for organizing this. I'm going to revisit some of the themes that Silvia really pretty encyclopedically laid out from a slightly different angle. I think increasingly, as we confront climate change and confront the discussion about climate change, a lot or more and more is hinging on technology, or what Silvia, using a language that I agree with 100%, called a techno-fix. And I want to discuss what a little abstractly what we mean when we say techno-fixes and technology. Then I'm going to talk about why this type of discussion is happening in the first place. I'm going to talk about the consequences of having or being forced to have this type of conversation on popular movements and popular classes' ability to resist climate change and fight for just transition, and what kind of discussions are foreclosed or censored or muffled or erased by this kind of overwhelming discussion that is presented to us as the normative discussion. So one of the most insidious aspects, I think, of capitalist theology and the discourse that goes with it is this idea that one, technology is a neutral instrument, and that two, technology is inevitably associated with progress. Therefore, any of us who question this are that horrible thing against technology. So I think one of the most important tools that we can learn to deploy, or in fact weapons against this type of confusion, is to know that there's no such thing as technology. There are only concrete technologies in concrete situations pushed by particular people and developed for particular reasons. There may be capacities to take back some certain technologies, and some technologies may indeed be neutral, like a knife. But overwhelmingly, a great deal of technologies are not at all neutral. And geoengineering is absolutely one of those technologies, on the one hand. On the other hand, with this discursive trick where we're presented as being against technology, we're actually disarmed in terms of fighting against, sorry, I'm getting, 1 second, please, sorry.
Okay. I guess.
Very sorry for that.
So working from home.
Yeah, there's a strange technology, which is a landline. So what I want to say is we should start from a position of instinctive hostility or suspicion towards these technologies that are presented in front of us as solutions. And we should think about why people are putting them in front of us, to what ends, and what they mean to accomplish, and what the risks are, which I think is what Silvia really laid out brilliantly. So why is this discussion about geoengineering happening in the first place? I mean, I agree with a lot of what has been said, but I also think there is a push to buy time for certain forms of technical solutions, so that as much as possible of the existing infrastructure of imperialism and capitalism and their associated technologies can remain in place. This is because people don't want to totally retool the entire apparatus of accumulation and consumption. There is unwillingness to, and there's an unwillingness to essentially expropriate or to render their value zero all the oil reserves. And there's a lot of parties that are interested in that not happening. So the idea is that this is a discourse of postponement and deferral, and to prevent those urgent fixes for humanity from actually happening. There's also a way that the techno-fix exports the costs from the people who ought to pay them, namely, first of all, the oil companies, and second of all, the Western governments on the whole, onto the lower classes, especially in the global South, who will actually be confronting, first of all, the risk of all the risks associated with geoengineering, which are massive because it's an entirely speculative, unpredictable technology. No one knows what will happen with shifts in terms of the monsoons, if there could be wide-scale harvest failures and so forth. So there's a huge element of unknowability that the precautionary principle should direct us actually to make us very suspicious of geoengineering, because we don't know what the consequences are. And in fact, we also know that there are mechanisms to deal with climate change in the here and now that do not involve geoengineering. So why aren't those being considered, right? That is what we need to push back against when we hear this discussion about geoengineering. The third component is what are that we should consider are, what are the consequences of this becoming an overwhelming conversation within even radical climate justice circles, are kind of gnawing away or nibbling away at the edges of radical climate conversation. What does this have in terms of consequences for mobilizing both popular opposition to the elite or ruling class climate agenda and mobilizing people for a just transition? I think what it does most fundamentally is it actually destroys and confuses resistance. What it does is it actually forces popular movements to play on the terrain that has been designed by the ruling class or the elite governance institutions, and attempt to modify that terrain, or to think, okay, well, perhaps we can use this to our benefit, or perhaps there is a way to retool this technology that you are claiming to develop for your needs, and actually we can use it to develop it for our needs. And it can also lead to a kind of view from nowhere. And it comes up a lot in this discourse, or this language of we, right? We have to do this or we have to do that. And of course, the view from nowhere, whenever someone's this is an abstract, universal perspective, of course, that's always the perspective from like London and Washington and Paris, right? There's no such thing as a universal perspective. There's particular perspectives. So when we find us talking about a we that encompasses, people in this kind of undifferentiated world who are living in very, making extreme wealth in metropolitan capitals, and the we also includes Guatemalan peasants, we have to be very suspicious. What is the work that this we is doing? And one of those things that I think it is doing is it is directly confusing a resistance to the elite, the capitalists, the ruling class agenda. And part of constituting that resistance is precisely constituting an autonomous pole, an autonomous ideological, organizational, political, and social pole. And part of that is constituting an independent discourse on technology, because we aren't, of course, against technology at all, right? No one in the entire world is against this thing, technology. What we want is to have people's technology, and therefore a people's discourse about technology that says, okay, we need to think about what are appropriate technologies to deal with the whole range of social situations, social crises, ecological crises, ruling class offensives against the world, against the planet, and against indigenous classes and popular classes, and groups in the third world and in the fourth world, and so forth. So it's precisely one of the effects of this entire shift of the argumentative and political terrain to the terrain that is designed by people who do not have the best interests of the majority humanity in their minds, is to actually confuse the ability to resist that agenda. So just in conclusion, very briefly, but if people would want to talk about it more in the Q&A, I'm happy to. in that process of confusion, there's also a foreclosure of a very different conversation, right? So, and this very much, to anticipate, this relates to that question of, all right, climate change is already so urgent and desperate that we need geoengineering. We need to do something. Okay, first of all, I think, of course, most of the majority world understands both that climate change and actually the current social system, capitalism, themselves are both very urgent and desperate and causing apocalypses worldwide. So this is not new to people who are, of course, suffering under oppression. But more specifically on this question of geoengineering, it's very well known, although probably not as well known as it should be, and not enough is known about it as should be known, that there are very effective ways to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. Most basically, this can be done using forms of agroecological farming through types of knowledge-intensive land management, through certain forms of ecosystem restoration, which involves very often humans being hands-on in that process of ecosystem restoration. It involves active management of pasturing lands. It also involves a process of research and development into how to improve what is called, both the indigenous technical knowledge, but also the, other people's forms of knowledge there's already a substantial knowledge base. The point is that it does and can be improved through scientific investigation. But actually, these issues are severely and purposefully understudied both by Western scientific institutions and also Southern scientific institutions, to the extent that they have their agendas directed by big business science research in the West. So as a very rough estimate, we know it's fairly well established, it's possible to draw down something between 100 and 200 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalents through these forms of what people are very unfortunately and confusingly calling natural geoengineering. I think, no, we can call these, we should stick to actually discussing the concrete technologies, hands-on pasturing methods, intensive rotational grazing, agroecology, and so forth. That ballpark, assuming or dreaming that emissions could be stopped more or less very soon, would actually be more than enough to save the planet, right? There's a hitch, or there's a problem with those forms of agricultural management or land use management. Most of them, first of all, are not to the great profit of large corporations. Two, they rely on people having ownership of the land, especially smallholders, pastoralists having usufruct right to the land. And so, in fact, they relate to democratic distribution of power and rights and ownership and relying on decentralized forms of knowledge. So I think it's very, very apparent why the elites in the West would not wish to encourage those forms of technology. But I would urge that, in fact, focusing on developing an interest in thinking about how to support and develop both socially and intellectually all those forms of knowledge, those forms of people's technology are, in fact, at the very core of developing a popular, autonomous response to climate change that is capable of carbon drawdown, and is actually capable of reflecting the interests of the majority of the world's population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max. Thank you so much for that. And of course, we'll be returning to your points during the Q&A. And then now I will pass it on to Tom Goldtooth. Tom, you're welcome. Tom, you're muted.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, the presentation by Silvia and Max. This topic of geoengineering is very complex and has many layers. In my presentation, I want to focus on the ethics. I want to focus on the perspective from many of our indigenous peoples that I've been fortunate to talk to about this subject, not only from here in North America, but throughout my travels throughout the world. It's really important that decision makers, and especially civil society, listens to the traditional knowledge of our indigenous peoples. It's within our traditional knowledge that guides us and defines that important relationship that humanity has to have in relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth, the sacredness of our Father Sky. This is part of that circle of life, very important. And so, and in our relationship from where I come from with our Eastern Dakota people, our Bedewa Kantawa, the dwellers on the sacred lakes, we have a relationship to the Star Nation, and the Milky Way has many teachings. So that's why in my consultation with our spiritual elders, and I tell them about this geoengineering and what people are doing out there in the world, they shake their head because it goes back to our teachings about our relationship to the skies, to the universe. And this is how I look at things when I travel. I take this memory with me, very important. On my mom's side, we are the Southern Dene, the Navajo people. And within our Navajo people is similar with the Dakota Sioux people, is that there's not just symbols, but these are instructions that have been left with us and for us, but not just for ourselves. We are at a time when a lot of things are happening globally. The Mother Earth is speaking. The Father Sky is reacting. So these drawings, sand paintings here represent that relationship of Mother Earth and Father Sky. Father Sky extends throughout the Star Nation and throughout the universe. This has taken some of the symbolism that we have here in the Great Lakes and our relationship between the two worlds, the in-between of the two worlds, the sky and the waters, the earth itself. And we are in that center. And all these circles are the 13 moons. The 13 moons that defines our relationship to our mothers, our grannies, our grandmothers, our daughters. Very important in these concepts of the natural laws of creation. Very important. Many of you have seen our medicine wheels. And on my Navajo side, we come from the five-finger people, the human people. And part of that teachings is that as two-legged people, we have this mind, this to think, and how we use the thumb. How we use the thumb is very critical, because using this thumb can also be destructive to that balance and harmony that has been taught to many of our indigenous peoples. And that's why talking about this is very important, because as we look at what Silvia has talked about, as we look at what Max has talked about, I'm not going to go into the details, okay, of the pulling down or the capturing of this of carbon, but not just carbon, it's the greenhouse gases and the capturing, the concept of the capturing I just want to skim through that concept. Some of you may have heard me talking about the concepts of dominion, and not only dominion over the woman and the wives, but the dominion over Mother Earth. So it's that concept of capturing that is a trigger to many of our people of a warning, and it's part of the patriarchy as well, is the concepts of these experimentations, the modification of the sacredness of Mother Earth by implementing these different technologies, but also looking at the sky and the importance of the sky, our father sky, and looking at these predators, these universities, these scientists that are embracing this experimentation, the corporate monies behind those, and government. So these are sky protectors. That's the way I look at messing with the atmosphere. Scopex is one of those. And we put a halt to that by contacting the indigenous elders in Arizona, the state here in the United States, where they wanted to experiment with balloons and releasing these particulates, sulfites, limestone. So this is where the elders down there said no. So they went through their tribal governments and says no to this. This is their territories as indigenous peoples. So along with this techno-fixes, we come to incorporating the process of the financialization of nature, natural capital accounting, and all these are woven into this then. And then the economy that's based upon this extraction, predatory type of approach to our economy that gives them kind of like permission to do these experimentations within their colonial laws and their legal system. What gives me the mandate to talk about this? It's this grandmother who is Navajo, Dene, Southern Dene. She said she came to speak for those that cannot speak for themselves. She was talking about the air. She was talking about the soil, life itself, and she went to the UN to protect her lands that are being encroached by the coal mining. So the importance of the rights of indigenous people is very important. This indigenous sovereignty, I can make this as a reference to our group that you can have access, because in 2007, after near 20 years of indigenous peoples going to the UN, there was the adoption of a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. So there are many different articles, and these articles I lifted up relate to this push by these technologies and the people behind them to come to indigenous lands and territories. I'm not going to go into the details of some of those, but this is really right space as we look about our rights to protect our environment, our ecosystem. This is the land where I live. There is Piscine that we say in Dakota, Piscine. Our Ojibwe elders, their people call it Minoman, that grows underwater. It's the natural rice. If you look at the sky and the water and the reflection, this is that spiritual relationship. If there's any violation on the harmony and balance of the sky by these techno-fixes, disruption of the solar and that relationship, nature has its way of healing itself. Any disruption is going to affect the rice in this environment where I live. Climate change is a very critical issue. These technologies are a distraction. They're a distraction, what was mentioned before. They're not a solution to climate change. And this is one of my brothers. He's out ricing on the lake, knocking the rice off the plant, the tips into the canoe. This is some pictures of the rice that's collected. This is spiritual food for us. And that's why this geoengineering could be a mechanism to destroy that relationship and that balance of Mother Earth, Father Sky, the cosmology of who we are. And it's a colonial legal system, mechanistic worldview. It has a commodification to it. It has its own definition of sovereignty based upon dominion, objectification, property rights, and laws. It's all woven into this. So as Indigenous peoples, we are organizing and building our base under self-determination to regulate and control what comes into our territories. That's what we are doing here, to defend our rights and the rights of Mother Earth. Our responsibilities, as I mentioned, is our place in the sacred circle, our relationship with all life, and to have a living economy. So our principles are based upon Earth jurisprudence, the recognition of our rights and its link to rights of Mother Earth. Very important to take action is that humanity, all people who are watching this, we got to support the rights of our Indigenous peoples based upon the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. ICE 9/11. I've been in contact with our relatives, our brothers and sisters way up at the top of the world, and this Arctic Ice Project, where they're going to dump these little glass beads on the ground to where the ice is, the snow is melting. But they haven't asked permission. They haven't gone to the people of the land to give them informed information about what this is all about. They have violated the principles of FPIC. One thing, these technologies and the predators behind them, they don't go to the grassroots people. They find people that can give them permission, that don't represent all the people. So we are dealing with that. So we're here to protect and defend the territorial integrity of Mother Earth and Father Sky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that. Thank you for reminding us what's at stake. Very powerful intervention. Thank you so much. And so we are now heading to we're almost at the Q&A, but I just want to quickly summarize what the three of you have said, like some of the most striking points for me. With Silvia, the thing that you made it very clear is that is a dangerous and a dangerous destruction, right? And they deter us from basically and able to critically think at emission, the source, and questions of consumption. So that is something that has really strongly in your presentation. Max, you've made it very clear that no technology is a neutral instrument. We're not anti-technology or anti-progress, but we are anti particular forms of technology and progress that continue to basically particular elite around the world, as those who are marginalized on the front lines of the climate crisis continue to suffer, not just the impacts of the crisis, but the impacts of these technologies whose safety and reliability we still do not know. And for Tom, you've made it very clear around just how you've spoken about how the continued marginalization of indigenous knowledge, indigenous cosmologies, right, through the colonial legacies and afterlives, and these technologies actually form part of the afterlives of colonial power, where we consider the earth, where we consider everything just things to be extracted by others. And you talk very clearly about the issue of free, prior, and consent, that often these technologies, the people in the land, especially indigenous people, and where the experiments have been on indigenous territories, consent from the people has not been sought. And so this is very clear for us that we have to really rethink our relationship with nature, but also to continue to center, the impact of colonization and colonial legacies in terms of the ways in which the climate change discussions are being held. And often these are conversations that are erased. So I will open the floor to the three of you for maybe if you have any burning comment, but I would prefer that we go straight to the question and answer. Quite a number of comments have come in. Some have already been answered. So I will start with one question from Kamal. I'm not going to start in a straight line. So Kamal, Dr. Dax Kamal from Nepal asks, could agroecology be an alternative solution for geoengineering? Would that be an alternative to geoengineering? So quite a number of comments around what are the alternatives, right? What do we do? If we're saying that we are rejecting geoengineering technologies, what are the living realities and what visions of, progress and development can we envision for ourselves that lead us out of this capitalist, extractivist paradigm and so-called solutions to the climate crisis? So this is to the three of you. What is the way forward? What are the solutions that can be offered? So, Max, I'll start with you. Sylvia? Okay, no, Sylvia.
No. It's okay.
Oh, no, it's because the question. No. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Thank you. No, well, yeah, thank you for all the questions, and I think this is important. In fact, the point I try to do, Kamal, is that yes, we have a lot of solutions. For instance, today, the majority of the world's population, about 70% of the world population, get their food by what we call the peasant network, which is not only peasants, it's peasants, pastoralists, fishers, artisanal fishermen, and urban gardening also. And all this is the equivalent of 70, it gives food to the equivalent of 70% of the population, while the industrial food system is one of the main single causes of climate change. Is more than half of the gases comes from the industrial food system, from agriculture to all the wastes and all the transports and all the packaging and refrigeration and all that. When you put all that together, it's about half of the greenhouse emissions. And we already know that if we restrict that is also causing the actual pandemic and many others and many other diseases. If we restrict that, and if we really don't allow these really giant corporations to decide about our food and about our land, about our forests, then suddenly that is an enormous, less of emissions. But also from our side, we also have all these ways of producing food in an extremely efficient ways, diverse ways that are also healthy, that give a lot of more work, that are part of the cultures. So it has a lot of other pluses. So this is only one part of it. What I mean is that we do have a lot of other solutions. Maybe we need to, develop some of them, but the issue is that we cannot fall in the trap of thinking that everything can stay as it is. We can maintain the injustice. We can maintain the level of consumption for a very small part of the population that is eating the rest of the planet, and then we will need geoengineering. No, we can't, because geoengineering will even destroy the present alternatives we already have. For instance, it will compete bioenergy with CCS, and even other form of CCS will contaminate and compete with food production. So so of course, yes, this is one of the solutions. The issue is that from our side, we don't have one solution. We don't have a techno-fix. We don't have a one-size-fits-all. We have a diversity of alternatives that we need to strengthen. But of course, we also need to change the causes of the pollution, because otherwise we will never get to a useful point.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I'll someone else to answer the question before we head on to the other questions. What are the alternatives, Max and Tom?
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of been, it's not nearly as widely known as it should be. That yes, agroecology and parallel forms of agricultural production can actually be carbon negative. I mean, and the very fact that this is not widely known is itself because there's a propaganda campaign in favor of these we can call them high-tech geoengineering, as opposed to what we could call low-tech forms of natural carbon drawdown using agroecology. What Silvia said is extremely important, is that at least half and maybe up to 70% of the people, of the food that's consumed by most people in the world comes already from small farms that use some form, at least have one foot in traditional farming technology, which is the basis for agroecology. And this is not asking people to deal with radically reduced yields or consumption or anything like that. In fact, overwhelmingly, in nearly every country in the global south where it's been studied, agroecology has increased yields on the one hand. On the other hand, agroecology is carbon negative. What it does is it is essentially seeding carbon dioxide, pulling it in from the atmosphere and getting it into the soil. You have healthier soil, which has more soil organic matter. It's better able to retain carbon. There's bigger, thicker root structures, especially when you deal with perennials versus annuals, or plants that you don't have to cut and replant every year. So they develop really intense root structures that store a huge amount of carbon. There is peer-reviewed evidence. I mean, peer-reviewed evidence is not the be-all and end-all, but it is important that we have scientific documentation about some of these things for when we enter certain forms for arguments that, in fact, cattle raising can be done in a carbon-negative way using these kind of hands-on intensive management practices. This can actually draw carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. So there's kind of this kind of ascendant idea that we need to go vegan, and that cattle are and all forms of pastoral life are blight on the world. And in fact, it's probably not true. It doesn't make sense, because large animals have lived on planet Earth for a very long time and been hunted and also tended by humans for a very long time. For them to suddenly have become the crisis of humanity is odd, and something we should look suspiciously at. So my point is that when we look at all of those forms of production as a collection, we really can draw down a very significant portion of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere, and probably get below 300 parts per million. Nobody knows for sure. It's entirely speculative, like most of this. But the technology is not speculative. What's speculative is the precise amount that we can draw down, and that's totally fine. I mean, like I said, this is a technology that actually low tech that actually helps people have better lives, rather than being a tool for dispossession and accumulation. So I think we should look to that and say we have there is a people's tool that is in the hands of the people, and that should be supported and developed and should be invested in for national scientific research, above all in the global south, but also in the global north.
Ruth, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yes, agroecology is very important. But I think that when we talk about that, we must also be very firm that it must be outside of a carbon market system. Again, like I said, carbon markets and this phenomenon where the industry corporations are starting to pursue carbon soil carbon farming. And even in the smart agriculture discussion in the UN climate meetings, they talk about climate-friendly seeds. So there has to be a clarification when we talk about agriculture to not bring it into that carbon market system. I think what we've been advocating for within our indigenous movement and our allies is that there has to be an end to the fossil fuel taxes and the subsidies globally. I've seen some reports about how massive that the funding mechanisms are that continue to reinforce fossil fuel development, the combustion process. And globally, governments provide an estimated $775 billion to $1 trillion annually in subsidies to fossil fuel corporations. This is continuing. My final comment on this is that our network has been participating with other NGOs like Bank Track, Sarah Club, Oil Change International, Rainforest Action Network, and the last report, last year's report, 2019, the Banking on Climate Change. What was found is that since the Paris Agreement in 2015, that the investments in fossil fuel development is $1.9 trillion. And that's, that's rising every year. Canada, Chinese, European, Japanese, and US banks. So it's business as usual. So the real solutions is making a transition away from a fossil fuel economy. That's not being implemented at all. So they come up with these false solutions that what we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And Tom, I'm gonna ask, there's a question from Andrew Lockley. Well, several questions or several comments. And the very first one is, which do you think is most harmful to marginalized and indigenous people and change or climate engineering? Well, he does proceed to answer it. I'm not sure whether it's sarcastic or not, but he does answer it. But, well, that's a question. So what do you prefer? Harmful, it's a question that sort of takes us back. What do we prefer? Marginalization or geoengineering?
There is no difference between that. It's still part of what we say is that predator mindset. It's a bundle of what they put together in the basket or in the bowl. And they want us to then to differentiate what is better or what is worse. Some even use risk assessment modeling. Okay, pick what is really we need to address first. When we're saying what they have done is that they put it into the bowl, all the endangerments of what we are saying. So we hesitate to be in the process of trying to evaluate using what kind of indicators, what kind of values is going to be utilized in that determination. We have found that the dominant society and the scientists of that, they use these different indicators that have no relationship of our values. How do you quantify spiritual values? They don't know how, and is it appropriate to do that? Thank you.
I actually want a follow-up comment, a question on that before there are also other questions. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that indigenous people, those of us who live in the global south, marginalized people, are often asked to, decide how we want to die, right? These are questions that are constantly offered up to us, but the people who cause the climate crisis are asked to decide these questions. So I think it also goes back to, your whole conception around colonial legacies. And we see that this technology is a part of that, where we are given, those of us who are marginalized, those of us who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, are always given the most horrible choices, which are really non-choices, to choose from, as the rest of the world, as the people and the corporations that put us in this position to begin with are able to continue with their lives. So that was a comment in terms of just an expounding also of what you just said. You can return to it later, but I know that Silvia and Max also want to answer several questions. There's a question around how do we, sorry, let me just find it. How do we remove 1 trillion tons of CO2 without nets? You can't do it without natural solutions. So that's another question that has come in from the chat box.
Well, what I would like to answer to that is that it is interesting that someone can say that there is a solution to remove carbon, because there isn't. There is no technical solution to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it permanently. And the reason why, for instance, the oil companies hasn't used CCS, even if they have this technology for decades, is because it was simply not economically viable for them. And now they have repackaged this in a climate technologies, and they hope to get a lot of climate financing, but also a lot of public money to subsidize, destruction of more oil. There is not proof that there is any technology that can, of those proposed by geoengineering that really can remove anything. However, it's clear that there is natural cycles in nature that can balance things in long term. And we cannot, it will also be completely wrong to say that, oh, natural solutions are fine. No, of course not. If they are like monoculture plantations or transgenic crops to be more reflective or because this is not part of nature. So there is no way around to know that to address climate change, we have to address injustice. And as I said in the beginning, 7% of the population, 50% of the population, 50%, absolutely most of the people in Africa, the majority of people in Asia and Latin America, all together, I don't think even we emit 7%, but that is what Oxfam said, that all of us together, we emit 7% of the gases. And then we have a very small 10% that emit over half, 53%. So, of course, there is no technology for that. There is not a net technology for that. What we need is to stop the greed of these people, to stop this mechanism to be extracting and destroying the systems that can really absorb the excess of carbon and all that. And I do realize, and I also feel that we are in a very dire situation with climate, with biodiversity, but also with injustice, as I said in the beginning. And we need to confront them all together. And to confront them all together, we have to go to our own solutions and to the root causes, because otherwise we will only be feeding the vicious circle where, the people that has the money, the power, they will be deciding what are the technologies that maybe can function. Which really is striking is that there is a narrative that is not only from geoengineering, but in general, to say that, yeah, it is okay to continue as we are. Everyone, as Andrew Lockley also asked, is say, well, which geoengineering is saying is not for emission reduction? No, nobody's saying that. They are acting it de facto. For instance, you know very well, and many others if you don't know, that many of these companies that are developing geoengineering technologies that such as direct air capture, they are in contracts with Exxon, with Chevron, with Audi, with Volkswagen, with really big, large emitters of greenhouse gases. And they do that because they see that this is a business for them. But this is not going to go down. The Gas and Oil Network has shown, this is a report from just a few months ago, that all the oil companies are projecting their extraction much over the budget for 2 degrees in the earth. And this is about new extraction. So of course we need to stop all that, because otherwise all this, what you call removing technologies, will never, by no means, be enough. So what we need is not technologies, invest in dangerous technologies, because maybe they could remove. We need to invest and support the things we already know will stop this craziness.
Thank you so much, Silvia. And just before Max gives his response, again, a small commentary on what Silvia has just said. One of the things we often don't talk about is the kinds of structures and power relations around these technologies, right? Just even the link that you've made in terms of, the fossil fuel companies have with, the research funding and the technologies, and also philanthrocapitalism. Also, if you look at of the big funders of the research institutions working on geoengineering technologies. So we see that it's such a small clique, such a small elite, you know, and also as it stands, these technologies can only be afforded, or the research can only be done by, and I will say it, mostly white men in the global north. Yet the impact of the climate crisis is on Black and brown people from across the world. Again, even just power imbalance, you know, is very striking, even within the research and the funding of these technologies. Thank you, Silvia. Max?
Yeah, I would like to answer Andrew's question by invoking some language perhaps not entirely familiar to him, which is this question of positionality. I find it curious that the question can even be posed. I mean, as both as Ruth and Silvia have said very clear, that there is this absurd question, how do you want to die? But there isn't the question posed, how can I help you live? I mean, what I view as this type of conversation that has actually been deliberately constructed here, that people have gone out of their way to organize here, that there is a global campaign around, is actually an invitation to be part of a transformative movement, with actually has certain specific obligations in the global north, such as to mobilize around things like climate debt repayments, to mobilize around free transfer of clean energy technology, to mobilize around the immediate reduction of northern energy use, and things like that. Things that would actually require a certain burden because they actually would involve a political struggle against power. On the other hand, there are things like climate geoengineering that are being bankrolled by the Gates Foundation. Now, I personally think that we should actually engage in a struggle to build a transformative movement for a permanent social change that actually requires us in the North, people like me and Andrew, to struggle and actually take some guidance in this respect from people in the South. I think anything else very often ends up being some other form of Northern saviorism, and ends up actually going against what it claims to be for.
Thank you so much,
Hey,
Max.
Ruth,
Yes.
I just want to lift up again one of the foundations of climate change, but the foundations of this mentality for this world not to take real action. Some of you were with us in Cochabamba in Bolivia, April 10th, I think it was, in 2010. At a gathering. There was small farmers, peasants, indigenous peoples, labor, women's societies, youth, and about 30 countries that accepted the invitation from the indigenous president in Bolivia at that time. And it was a big issue. And after much debate, after much articulation of these different issues, the decision was that the root cause of climate change is capitalism. That drives this whole issue of oil, fossil fuels, energy, water access, and militarization is part of that. So if we need to change something here, what drives the funding and research mechanism, and who's pushing that from Harvard to whoever university? It's money, it's capitalism. So that's something that really we have to look at as part of our strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And my commentary on your last point will actually be from one of our good allies and supporters, Annabella Lemos, who I see in the chat box. And Annabella says that the solution will not come from the same place that created the crisis that we are in. And so I think we have answered the variety of questions, unless I am mistaken. Quite a number of questions around resources. We've pasted some of them on the chat box, but we're very happy. We've given an email address. We're very happy to receive your basically your emails, and we'll respond to them. But also the poster has very clearly some of the websites and the social media pages that we have. And so we have around 5 minutes, or we could be slightly more, but I would love to give the three panelists a final word, a final conclusion before I close it off. And we'll start with how we started. Silvia?
Well, I think I say the main points, but I think that many of you maybe wants to know more about the technology. Some of the questions were, what is this? What should I think of this and that? This was not this session to go through every technology, but if there is a demand, we can do that. Of course, we can organize that. But as I said, there are a lot of documents there. What I think is really, really important is that we look for more and more places where we can counteract this narrative, the narrative of that we have nothing to do. We are in such an urgent situation and we have no time. So the only thing we can do is to go again to the same that has caused the problem. And I would say exactly the opposite, like Gopal Dayaneni at DTC said first, and it says that we don't have time to do emergencies. We have to go to the roots.
Thank you, Silvia. That was brilliant. Max?
No, I don't have any closing comments. Thank you.
Okay. Tom?
Well, every time I'm asked to do something like this, it really touches my heart and takes me back to many different moments when I've talked to spiritual authorities from different indigenous nations, not just here in the US and Canada, but in my travels to Guatemala, the Khoisan people from South Africa. And I enjoy this discussion. And they're the ones that say, give authority to speak about this, because they say the world has really lost its faith to its relationship to that sacredness of our Mother Earth. If the world, humanity doesn't understand what I shared, they will continue to dwell on false solutions. So that's why I just want to lift up. It's with the authority of spiritual elders that have given many of us permission to speak about this, and they give you permission to analyze this and speak about it as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for that. Very privileged to have been in conversation with the three of you. Thank you for the wisdom that you have brought into this space and the critical analysis that you have brought into this conversation. As Silvia mentioned, this was a grounding session. This was basically a session where we slowly start to, what's at stake in the climate change discussions, but also around these technologies. So it was a session where we're going to deal with the questions of power, which the three panelists have done such a brilliant job in laying bare for us. We'll have more webinars. We'll have another webinar at the end of this month, or the very first week of November. We'll release dates in the next week or so, and we'll also have another webinar in December. So it seems quite a number of people want to speak specifically about the technologies. So we will have, we'll talk about what the themes are going to be for the next sessions. So in the links, as I said, quite a number of links have been pasted on the chat box. And I know obviously not everyone pays too much attention to the chat box, but feel free to contact us. The home campaign is on, you can go to geoengineeringmonitor.org, geoengineeringmonitor.org, and you will find us. You'll also find us on Twitter, Geoengineering Monitor. We're also on Facebook as Geoengineering Monitor. So feel free to reach out to us and we'll respond to your queries. If it's possible, before we close in the next 1 minute, you could maybe paste the, oh yeah, it's here. Yeah, here they are. So our Twitter is, yes, our Twitter is GeoMonitor. Our Facebook is Geoengineering Monitor. Then we have two websites. One is, Oh yeah, yes. Handsoffmotherearth.org and geoengineeringmonitor.org. And the poster is available on social media. So reach out to us and we'll be very happy to engage further. Everyone is welcome, obviously, into our conversations. And so it's exactly, wow, we're good at time. This is the time we're supposed to end. So it's brilliant, it's perfect. Thank you to the panelists, thank you to everyone, and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.